Matilda of Flanders, who could also have been known as Mathilde or Maud, is an often brushed over figure, famous only for being the wife of William the Conqueror, of supposedly agreeing to his hand after he beat her up, and for being very short. As this video, and part 2 in our next video, will show, only some of these facts are true, others are definitely false. And much more evidence shows her as a powerhouse of a woman with influence over her husband, their children, and his lands. Much of Matilda's early life is shrouded in mystery. A tentative date for her birth year exists of 1031. Her parents, however, we do know, the future Count Baldwin V of Flanders and Adela of France, daughter of Robert II, King of the Franks. The reason for Matilda's birth year of 1031 is attributed to a contemporary chronicler, William of Jumièges, who stated that Baldwin apparently rebelled against his father in that year, partially because his marriage to Adela was unconsummated. This is not likely, however, as in fact Baldwin had rebelled much earlier than this and he and his father agreed to co-rule in 1030. Further to this is the fact Matilda had 2 brothers, Robert and Baldwin, and it's not sure what order they were born in. There were apparently other brothers and sisters, but no details remain for them, so we cannot even be sure if they existed or not. Flanders itself was a hugely important principality, a stepping stone between England and France, important for trade as well as for holding back invasions from Scandinavia. Prior to Baldwin V, Flanders had struggled with both Germanic and French languages being spoken, large areas were uninhabitable as swampland, and towns were small compared to their neighbour of Normandy. But Matilda's father improved his lands by creating new roads and canals to stimulate trade, especially in wool, and this in turn modernised Flanders' growing urban centres. But this wasn't the only reason Matilda was described in her lifetime as high-born. She could also claim lineage to Alfred the Great of England, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, and was related to most of the French nobility. From the day of her birth, Matilda was a glittering prize for those who wanted to marry into this wealth, power, and ancestry. The 12th century chronicler Lambert of Ardres gives a detailed description of the castle where Matilda grew up in Bruges. It was made of wood, was large and grand, and stood on a hill overlooking the town below. It was made up of cellars and granaries on the lowest floor, with the dwelling areas on the next story up, including the grand chamber for Baldwin and Adela to sleep. Matilda would have spent time in a large private room just off this with the maids who watched the children, and would have slept on the uppermost story of the property with her sisters, if they indeed existed, her brothers on the other side of the palace. Matilda's main female role model was her mother Adela, who interestingly had something of a marriage of equals with her husband. She played an active role in the politics of her husband's lands, and her signature appears on more than half the charters issued during Baldwin's reign. From the start, Matilda had a strong influence of a noblewoman participating in running a kingdom. Not only this, but Adela oversaw the education of all her children, something expected of noble and royal women at this time. Unlike later centuries, higher-born women in the 11th century were almost expected to be intellectually more educated than their husbands, encouraged as daughters to read while sons practiced hunting and training for war. Matilda almost certainly knew Latin, which was spoken at court, as well as Flemish, although less likely that she knew how to write. Noble women had clerks to write for them as they dictated, but she was still literate in the sense of being able to read. She would also have learned embroidery and possibly the harp and viol, 2 instruments that were extremely popular at the time, and of course, she would have learned how to manage an estate. And most importantly for the time in which she lived, Matilda would also have received a strong education in religion. Adela was responsible for encouraging Baldwin to reform the church in Flanders, as well as founding several abbeys and collegiate colleges. Little surprise, she later became a nun. Matilda would also have been influenced by her devout aunt Judith of Flanders and her grandfather King Robert, also known as the Pious. Matilda was alive at a time when the monastic movement was sweeping across all of Europe, and she would later become one of the biggest patrons of it in both England and Normandy. Matilda may also have become influenced by another powerful woman, Emma of Normandy. Emma had married Ethelred of England in 1002, and when he was defeated by his rival Canute of Denmark, she had in turn married him as well, becoming Queen of England twice, the first woman to do so. Emma had grown a great fortune of her own and had great influence over both husbands, although her second marriage appeared to be more between equals. She was exiled by Harold Harefoot in 1037, and Baldwin generously offered her sanctuary in his lands. Although, in reality, this was likely to make what might prove to be a great ally. While Matilda was likely very young when Emma arrived, perhaps younger than 6 years old, the exiled queen stayed for a few years, and it's likely Matilda gained the benefit of her experience at the English court. During her stay in Bruges, Emma paid her own way and used her extensive network throughout Europe to promote her son Harthacnut as the rightful king of England. In 1039, Harold Harefoot was dead, and Emma and her sons were triumphant as they returned home to England. It was a masterclass in politics, allies, and how a woman could influence matters seemingly run by men. There was no set age for when girls were married off, but as would become common in later centuries, marriages could happen as young as 12 for daughters. In her late teens, sometime around the late 1040s, Matilda's father received an ambassador from the English king, Edward the Confessor, an English thane known as Breitrek. He was apparently conventionally handsome and masculine, with blonde hair and an enormous wealth under his control back in England. The Chronicle of Tewkesbury claims Matilda fell instantly in love with this man, who was probably 10 to 20 years older than her. When he returned to England, without her parents knowing, she sent an offer of marriage. This was the ultimate in 11th century teenage rebellion in an era when daughters were expected to acquiesce to their parents' knowledge and choice of a future husband for them. As it turned out, Breitrek wasn't interested and he rejected her offer. Matilda was furious. She had risked her reputation and the anger of her parents to someone who was, despite wealth and good looks, her social inferior, and had been rewarded with the embarrassment of a public rejection. It was something she would never forget, and in later years it was Breitrek who would regret how he had handled the event. But by 1049, when Matilda was about 18, her father was eager to put the whole rejection behind them. He began to look across the border to his powerful neighbour, Normandy. They were increasingly Frankish in their ways and language, but Normans were also proud of their Scandinavian roots, having been founded as a Viking settlement just the century before, and leaned into the idea of being powerful Nordic warriors. At that time, the duchy, for its current leader had named himself as the first Duke of it, was Duke Robert I of Normandy. He had only 2 surviving children, a daughter named Adelaide and a son, William. Both were illegitimate, although whether they shared a mother is unknown. William's mother was a local girl named Herleva, whose father was either a tanner, undertaker, or apothecary, and she and Robert probably met when he was in his mid-20s. In short, she wasn't noble. Robert seems to have genuinely fallen in love with Herleva, however, as when she became pregnant, he ensured her comfort and gave her relatives prestigious positions at his court. Many years later, after William took control of both England and Normandy, stories were created around his birth to show he had always been destined for greatness. Of his mother dreaming of her insides stretching out and covering both England and Normandy, or the tiny newborn William grabbing the rushes from the floor with unequalled strength for a baby. At the time, in reality, no one even gave thought to record his birth anywhere, just the baby of a liaison between the Duke and a local woman. However, William's father was proud of his only son and brought him up by his side at court. He would, as it turned out, be his only son. In January 1035, he named the boy as his heir. While later chroniclers were sensitive to his nickname of the Bastard, writing from eras when this word carried great shame, there was no such stigma at the time of William's birth. Marriage still did not always occur in favour of instead keeping concubines, and illegitimacy was not considered a barrier to inheritance. By 1049, William had, after a struggle for his rightful place and lands from his uncles, become a respected and feared leader across Europe. He had proven more than once that he was forceful in his military might, and for the 11th century world, brutal savagery was the yardstick of a good ruler. William had grown into a dominating and inflexible man, and was known for his brutal punishments to those who were on the losing side. However, none of this would have mattered had William not also been astute in political matters and recognised that brute force alone would not be enough. He was also, oddly enough, extremely pious and devoted much of his life to religious pursuits, including reforming the church and building several flourishing churches across his domains. Matilda and William could not have been more different physically. Excavations of the little remains we have of their possible bodies, their remains having been shuffled about and damaged during religious riots, show William was probably about 5'10", an enormous height at the time, and spoke with a harsh, raspy voice. Matilda was around 5 foot tall, a normal height for women in those days, despite misreports of her remains once suggesting she was only about 4 foot. She was slender and apparently very beautiful. But looks were not important, politics were, and William could immediately see the attraction of Matilda as his wife. There were many other accomplished and attractive noblewomen who were eligible, but Matilda had been brought up to understand politics and, importantly, knew something of international affairs. Her lineage was also flawless, and while his own illegitimacy wasn't a barrier to take the dukedom, Matilda's heritage would make life a lot easier for both William and their potential children. When Baldwin received messengers bearing William's offer of marriage, he was glad to listen to them. His lands were being threatened by the Holy Roman Emperor, and the English King Edward had agreed to send men to Flanders coast to aid the Emperor. Both William and Baldwin could do well out of being friendly allies, and for Flanders, an alliance with the powerful Normandy dukedom would increase trade for them across Europe. However, Matilda herself apparently refused to marry William on the grounds of his illegitimacy. The story goes that he was so infuriated by the snub that William rode with all haste to Bruges, accosted Matilda as she came out of church, and dragged her into the mud by her hair. He then proceeded to beat her within an inch of her life before riding off and leaving her to be tended by her bewildered female attendants. Her father immediately declared war on Normandy for such behaviour, but then he was shocked by Matilda apparently claiming she would marry none but William, who, she claimed, must be a man of great courage and high daring to have beaten her up in her own father's lands. A great deal of this story is likely very, very false, with a tiny grain of truth. It is possible that Matilda initially refused the match, although quite how much say she would be allowed, especially after the debacle with Breitrich, is very debatable. The story described above never appeared in any contemporary source, but rather in two dubious sources about 200 years after William and Matilda lived. The idea that a noble or royal marriage would start off this way is unthinkable, especially given how much Adela had impressed into her daughter her ancestry and position. And while it's not impossible William, a man with a renowned violent temper, might have thought about taking his rage out on Matilda, it's hugely unlikely that Matilda would somehow wish to marry him after this. It is possible Matilda may have felt less than thrilled about the match. It's even possible gossip reached the Norman court. But nothing is certain about the story, only that the sources for it are not contemporary and are unreliable for their bias. With the betrothal confirmed, William then turned his attention to gaining permission for the marriage from the Pope, but initially the marriage was condemned. Although marriage wasn't formally part of society yet, and the church itself was not the powerhouse it would become a few centuries later, it was still prudent to have its blessing on the matter. One of the new laws created by the Church to maintain control over ecclesiastical matters in Europe, and so by default the grasp of power in Europe, was that of only allowing marriage outside of 7 degrees of kinship. It's thought this could have been a possible reason for the Church rejecting the marriage, as Matilda and William were at least related in both the 5th and 7th degree. However, it's important to note at this point that the church's rules probably did not stem from any real concern over the possible incest of two people related only by an ancestor 7 generations before, but in the control this gave the church. If you were on friendly terms with the church, you could reject your wife if she didn't give you an heir if you were too closely related, or escape an abusive husband for the same. If you were on bad terms with the church, they could reject your marriage to make things difficult for you, gleefully knowing you and your potential spouse merely shared a great-great-great-great-grandpa. For William, the Pope was nervous, as was most of Europe, at the idea of this young duke gaining even more power and wealth than he already had, by aligning Normandy with a niece of the King of France. And while William could simply have gone ahead with the marriage anyway immediately, as some rulers did, his religious devotion wouldn't allow it. The Duke had a contingent of bishops and ecclesiastical advisors around him at all times to allow him to do penance for his savagery on the battlefield. So at first, he sent the most pious of his bishops to reason with Pope Leo. 2 years of fruitless negotiations went on until at last William's piety was worn down. Baldwin was equally as determined the match should go ahead to give him a powerful ally for Flanders, and William wanted Matilda. The marriage went ahead anyway, without the blessing of the church, and while the date is uncertain, Matilda and William were certainly married before the end of 1053 when she was described as his consort. Even the place is uncertain, as some sources say the wedding took place in the cathedral at Eu, or in the chapel of the castle there, and other sources still place it in Rouen. Some historians suggest this might mean the wedding took place secretly or with little celebration, not unexpected if they didn't want the church to immediately catch wind of it. In 1476, an inventory was taken of treasures held at Bayeux Cathedral, amongst them 2 matching cloaks believed to be the wedding garments of Matilda and William. They were covered in small golden crosses, precious jewels and embroidered flowers, along with a wide strip of cloth of gold across the back. This was not necessarily meant to be stylish, but more an advertisement of how wealthy they were. William even possibly wore a helmet at the ceremony to emphasize his warrior nature. Early on, Matilda made it clear she was not going to sit back and be a demure wife popping out heirs. William took the opportunity to remove his uncle, the Archbishop of Rouen, who apparently objected to his nephew's marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. However, the official reason was that the Archbishop spent more time on hunting and spending money on luxuries than he did spending time in religious duties, and his removal was approved by a papal legate. The real reason is probably also that William saw a possibility to remove a relative who was something of a rival who wanted his duchy, but the interesting part is that sources for this event state it was both William and Matilda who decided to remove his uncle. William and Matilda then travelled to his palace at Rouen, the gleaming capital of Normandy, along with her parents who stayed on for a few days until the wedding festivities were finished. Not only was it likely the Duke wished to impress his pretty new bride, but equally to show her off to his subjects, allowing her impressive ancestry to outshine any doubt over his own. And more than this, their marriage brought attention from other lands outside France, as Edward the Confessor sent a message that he wanted to name William as heir to the crown of England. To prove the validity of his offer, he sent 2 hostages with his Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumieges. Thing is, they were Wulfnoth and Harkon, the son and grandson respectively of Earl Godwin of Essex, someone Edward wanted to keep in check. While it may seem strange that Edward wanted to pass his throne to a duke from Normandy, there had actually been a lot of ties between the 2 places. Both countries had a shared Viking heritage, and many spouses had gone between Normandy and England to marry into the other's royal family for at least over a century. King Edward himself had spent a good chunk of his childhood with his siblings in Normandy, so he knew it pretty well, and probably had fond memories of living there. Added to this was the fact Edward had no children with his wife Edith, who happened to be the daughter of Earl Godwin. There's a theory that far from not consummating his marriage with Edith because of his piety, Edward actually refused to sleep with Edith because of his growing dislike towards the ambitious Godwin family. Eventually sending Edith off to a nunnery and outlawing her family was what triggered the need for him to name another successor. Considering his ties to Normandy, it's not surprising he looked across the channel to William. William even had some hereditary connections through his great-aunt Emma of Normandy, and Matilda had even closer connections, and importantly could trace her ancestry to Alfred the Great. But having said all this, despite the connections made, we can't even be certain that this offer was ever really made. Most evidence comes from Norman writers chronicling events after they happened, so it could be true, or it could be made up in order to justify what William did. It's not as though Edward was still around to ask by that point. But on the flip side, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also confirms that William travelled to England in 1051 to make certain this was a real offer of the throne, and the English king gave the Duke a ring and sword as proof of his promise. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was pro-English before anything else and wasn't likely to bother puffing up a Norman duke who invaded, so we can perhaps give this source a little more consideration. And even if William took it seriously, he must have known he was unlikely to receive much support for his claim in England. And obviously the powerful Godwin family, who controlled most of southern England, would oppose him. But however enticing the prospect of one day becoming England's king must have been, he had more pressing concerns closer to home, and Matilda would take an active part in them. Henry I, King of France, had made an ally of William's enemy Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, as well as supporting a rebellion led by William's two uncles, Archbishop Mougere and William of Arques. This left Normandy in a dangerous position, surrounded on all sides by enemies. The Duke's usual tactic of stab first, ask questions later worked well in seeing off Mougere and Arques, even when they were bolstered by forces from the French king. They would later flee Normandy forever. However, Henry and Geoffrey worked together to continue leading campaigns into Norman territory in 1054 and 1057, and this was harder to shake off. Matilda must have been somewhat dismayed by events, not least because no one likes fighting over an easy life, but because her marriage had been intended to create closer links between France and Normandy. The ongoing conflict proved that this simply wasn't happening. However, Matilda remained the steadfast, loyal wife by William's side, and it wouldn't be long before she probably took on her role as peacemaker. This was considered a position unique to royal and noble wives during the 11th centuries, as well as centuries before and after, of a wife being able to use the fact she was female to peacefully mediate a resolution between warring parties. It's highly likely that although it isn't recorded, Matilda used her position to try to calm the waters when necessary. On top of this, she had also fulfilled one of the main duties necessary for a duchess, creating heirs. Not long after their marriage, Matilda gave birth to a boy named Robert after both William's father and her grandfather, the King of France. Like a lot of their children, the exact date of little Robert's birth isn't certain, but it was possibly around 1053. Matilda was immediately in love with her firstborn child, but William was less impressed, nicknaming him Curthose, or short boot, due to his short height. It was the first time there would be conflict between Matilda and William, with one parent doting on the child and another being unnecessarily cruel. She would go on to give birth to 3 more sons, Richard, who was born around 1055, and little William in 1060. Her last son would be Henry, born around 1068 after his father became King of England. Matilda and the Duke also had daughters, but the chroniclers gave them far less notice, and as a result, it is difficult to know their names and dates for certain. The eldest daughter may have been Adeliza, born around 1057, and then Cecilia in 1058. There was also Constance, born sometime before 1061, and Adela, who would have been born just after the events of 1066. There may have been 2 other daughters, respectively named Agatha and Matilda, but the evidence for them is very scanty, and Agatha may in fact be Adeliza. What is certain is that Matilda was pregnant several times, and at a time when midwifery was simple and difficult, even noble and royal women could, and often did, fall prey to being ill after childbirth, dying from fever or blood loss, or simply from being too weak during pregnancy due to a diet low in protein and iron. On top of this, the life expectancy of infants was extremely low, and if someone managed to survive beyond the age of 5, they had a good chance of making it to adulthood. Amazingly, not only does Matilda appear to have remained healthy and strong throughout her many pregnancies, at least 8 of her children survived beyond infancy. It's possible there were some miscarriages that were not noted down, but it was still an amazing feat to pull off in the 11th century. This ability to give birth to so many heirs protected Matilda's position immensely. Matilda's role as a mother was especially important in the formative years of her children, especially as children up until the age of 7 were considered to have no moral reasoning. Therefore, their mother acted as a sort of moral compass who watched them closely, as well as providing the beginning of their education. While the children would not have been breastfed by their mother in order to allow her to become pregnant again quickly, instead having a wet nurse for that, the evidence shows that the children were all brought up alongside Matilda at her husband's court. She even had some help from the children's grandmothers, as Herleva and Adela both came to visit for extended periods of time and knew their eldest grandson Robert as a result pretty well. William of Malmesbury also states that despite the fact boys would have mostly been focused on by their fathers, both Matilda and William looked after the education of their children. As boys were expected to start learning how to ride and swing a sword from a young age, William likely took great pride in teaching his sons this. But Matilda would have focused on the other important aspect for them, that of reading, writing, and Latin. Sons were also expected to take part from an early age in politics and to have a good grounding in it. Sources show all 4 of their sons were witnesses to several charters while still children, and with her understanding of international politics, it's likely Matilda took on another role expected of upper-class women to advise them politically and on matters of policy. Added to this was the role of teaching them about religious matters, something William was also keen to impart on his sons. However, despite the Duke's focus on his male heirs, Matilda did not neglect her daughters. At that time, there were only 2 avenues open to daughters of the nobility: marriage or the church. Marriage wasn't guaranteed, as young men often went off to battlefields and died, leaving a population made up of more women than men. But the Duchess was determined her girls should have at least as good an education as she herself received, and she employed tutors to ensure it, such as Arnulf of Chalk, who was hired to teach the arts, Latin, rhetoric, and logic. Sources appear to show the girls were all close to Matilda and remained by her side until they had to leave either for a nunnery or marriage. The Duchess also made sure to carefully choose the tutors for her sons as well, and her eldest son, Robert, had at least 3 to prepare him for one day ruling Normandy after his father. Everything seemed to be going well for Matilda and William and their growing family. Their marriage was successful both in terms of expanding their brood and in a partnership between them both. The economy of Normandy had a boost throughout the 1050s through art, culture and wine, and the Duke and Duchess built many luxurious palaces to fit their lifestyle, some of which can be glimpsed through their remains today, at places like Cannes, Bayeux and Bonneville-sur-Touques, which was apparently their favourite. Many powerful noblemen and ecclesiastical advisors flocked to Normandy's flourishing court, either to seek a powerful position or generous patronage. Matilda was the centre for the poetry and culture that grew at court, however, commissioning histories of her and William's families, as well as patronising Latin poets and other literature. She would also raise the standard and etiquette of the Norman dynasty by overseeing grand banquets filled with pork, venison, beef, swan, heron and duck, all prepared with spices and herbs that would have been out of reach for the lower classes, as well as ensuring there were entertainments in the forms of musicians, jesters and poets. And further triumph came in 1059 when a new pope was elected, Nicholas II. However, the previous pope, Benedict X, had been deposed, and William quickly offered military assistance to the new pope against Benedict, in exchange for the tiny matter of seeing his marriage and children as valid. The approach worked, and Nicholas retroactively sanctioned their marriage, asking only that they make penance by building 2 new abbeys. This they would do, creating the Abbey of Sainte-Trinité and the Abbey of Saint-Étienne at Caen, as well as founding several hospitals throughout Normandy. Life was going well, and yet Matilda would face her greatest challenge yet, as William would change the course of European history forever by invading England. Throughout it all, Matilda would remain his loyal wife. But she would also rule Normandy alone as regent, become England's first Norman Queen of England, and influence the lives of not just her husband, but also of her children long after her death. Come back next week to see part 2 of Matilda's story. By 1059, Matilda of Flanders was in a powerful position. Wife of the fearsome and renowned Duke of Normandy, William, she was Duchess over a large and flourishing duchy, mother to several healthy children, and known for her beauty, piety, and patronage of culture. But everything was about to change as William set his sights on England's shores. To make up for marrying before the church had officially given permission, Matilda and William had set about building 2 grand abbeys in penance. William's was the incredible Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, otherwise known as Abbaye aux Hommes, which became a Benedictine monastery. Matilda's abbey was also in Caen, the Abbey of Sainte-Trinité, known as the Abbaye aux Dames, and was a Benedictine nunnery. Although the abbey wouldn't be fully completed until around 1103, it started running in 1059 under the supervision of Abbess Matilda, who was William's cousin. Both abbeys were magnificent, imposing structures, and they were as much a statement of the power and grandeur of Normandy as they were an apology. Duchess Matilda also ensured her abbey was sufficiently blessed and looked after by providing it with a slew of holy relics, ranging from supposed splinters from Jesus' manger to a strand of hair from his mother Mary, and fingers, blood, and even whole bodies of various saints. At the time, everyone, including Matilda and William, were deeply superstitious and religious, and they would have believed completely in the power of these strange objects. But both William and Matilda were also known to occasionally dabble in seeking advice from witches or mystics to foretell the future, and the Duchess was once recorded using sheep bones to find out her fortune, something brought from her native Flanders. However, the church was increasingly anxious about the threat of magic to its own authority, and through the early medieval period it would ensure the use of witches, mystics and superstitions would be viewed much more as a sin. In the early 1060s, Matilda would use her influence as Duchess of Normandy to create other grand religious institutions, much as her mother Adela had back in Flanders. In 1063, she began construction of Notre-Dame-du-Pré in Rouen, and she also founded St. George at Beaucheville and St. Florent at Saumur. Matilda also started to witness a lot more charters than she had before, and would have her name to more than 100 charters over her lifetime, although most were alongside William's. She would also, much like her later granddaughter Empress Matilda, be very involved in listening to petitions and legal cases brought before the court, often either helping to come to a decision or doing it in her own right. As for the personal relationship between William and Matilda, they seem to have only grown stronger over the course of their marriage. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that the couple genuinely seemed to have cared for one another, and that the Duke's tenderness for his wife only increased with each child she gave birth to. They appear to have had as close as possible to an equal partnership that the 11th century would allow. They had similar tastes, and Matilda wasn't known to have ever gone against William, although how much of this is devotion How much is simply knowing there was no point arguing, and how much may have been fear of his reaction, we will never know. But there is other evidence to show how deeply devoted the couple were to each other. Sometime after 1063, William grew seriously ill, enough that he gave up many of his personal relics and swore he would establish canons in St. Mary and Coutances if God saved him. Matilda went immediately to pray at that same church, making a gift of 100 shillings at the altar, dishevelled and with her hair loose. It suggests a woman who had been by her husband's side with little rest, not bothering to care about her appearance and only worried that he would survive. This most certainly might have been due to her love for William, but equally it could have been out of a fear of losing her position as the powerful Duchess of Normandy. As it turned out, whether it was God or simply luck, William was returned to health and did as he swore to do. In that same year, perhaps thinking of his own mortality after his illness, William formally arranged for his eldest son Robert to become the Duke of Normandy after he died. He made his nobles swear fealty to his son, a practice that would be continued in England by members of his family in years to come. He also, in 1063, gained the county of Maine, which had troubled Normandy for many years after the childless Count Herbert of Maine died and promised it to his neighbour. Normandy was now the undisputed power of northern France, and little could penetrate it. Back in 1051, the then King of England, Edward the Confessor, had promised his kingdom to his distant relative, Duke William. This was partially because Edward was childless and had fond memories of spending his childhood in Normandy, and partially to irritate his most disliked courtier who wanted his throne, the Earl Godwin. But it was more complex than this, and it's likely the whole promise was little more than a diplomatic gesture. In 1056, Edward's nephew, Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, was brought back to England from Hungary. The younger Edward was the perfect solution to the difficult situation of the crown going to either the Godwins or William. As he was more closely related, he would allow a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, and his gaining the throne was voted in unanimously by the Witan, the King's Council. He was also unattached to Normandy, which went down well with the Godwins. Unfortunately, in 1057, Edward the Exile finally arrived on English shores with his wife and children, only to die in mysterious circumstances before ever getting a chance to meet his uncle the king. Most historians agree there is no evidence he was in ill health, and there were certainly some people who would have preferred he didn't take the throne. Now this just left his eldest son in his place, named Edgar, who now became Edgar Atheling, in recognition of the king approving him for heir to the throne. However, Edgar was only about 5 or 6 years old, and so he was hardly a stable replacement for his father. But in 1064, an event occurred which played right into William's hands. Sometime early in the year, Harold Godwinson, the son of Earl Godwin, landed on the shores of Normandy. It's still a bit of a mystery as to why he was travelling towards France. Some chroniclers claimed it was to confirm Edward the Confessor's promise, others that he had gone to fetch his brother and nephew Wulfnoth and Hakon, who were still hostages in Normandy, and one chronicle even claims he drifted away from England on a fishing expedition. The most likely explanation seems to be that Harold had indeed gone to retrieve his relatives, but against the wishes of King Edward, something supported by the Bayeux Tapestry. Whatever the reason, he was brought to Eu and presented to William at his court in Rouen. Politically, William had rescued his English visitor and was treating him as an honoured guest. In reality, the Duke was keeping him close and keeping him prisoner for the time being. William and Matilda showed off their wealth and influence with lavish entertainments and banquets which Matilda would have been in charge of arranging, as well as ensuring Harold met all of their children in order to really bolster the fact they had a strong, rich dynasty that could easily take him on. But while nothing is recorded of what Matilda thought personally about their visitor, Some later sources state that the Duchess and Harold would often stay up talking long after William had gone to bed. Nothing is hinted at of an actual affair, but more that they found much in common. As Matilda had grown up with her father receiving English visitors to his court, and she knew quite a lot about the politics of England, it's likely she and Harold had more in common than anyone else at the Duke's court. Anything else is purely imagination. But as we will see, there may have been another reason for these late-night talks. William then really polished off this PR stunt in being a benevolent duke to English nobles by inviting Harold to join him on campaign to Brittany. This was to give the impression that they were actively fighting side by side, but again, it was really a chance for William to show off his military prowess, his soldiers, and could be seen as a warning. However, Harold is also recorded as rescuing 2 of William's soldiers from quicksand. The battle was won and Brittany was surrendered to William. He presented Harold with arms and weapons and knighted him on the spot. It is apparently after this point, according to Norman sources only, that Harold swore on holy relics that he would uphold William's claim to the English throne, witnessed by several of William's nobles. Whether or not this really happened this way is strongly contested, and even if it did, how much would it have been by Harold's own desire to do so is unknown. In fact, it's much more likely Harold knew he wouldn't be allowed to return home unless he agreed, a promise he had no intention of really keeping. To seal the deal, the Duke also offered up his eldest daughter Adeliza to be married to Harold, which was also to be conferred to a later date as she was just 7 years old at the time. Further to this, William also suggested Harold should send one of his sisters to Normandy once he was home in order to marry her to one of the Norman nobles. It has been suggested that the late-night talks between Matilda and Harold was actually the Duchess arranging the marriage between the Earl and her daughter to facilitate the agreement William wished to make with him. After this, Harold was free to return to England with Haakon, although Wulfnoth still remained in William's custody. However, not more than a year after returning, the Earl broke off his engagement to Adeliza and married Edith, sister to the Earls of Mercia. The Norman Duke and Duchess did not take the news well. Sometime in 1065, without actually specifying properly who he wished to follow in his stead, Edward the Confessor fell into a coma with few lucid moments, leaving most people to assume he wanted Edgar to be his heir. On the 5th of January 1066, the English king died, leaving his kingdom to a boy in his early teens. At around 15, Edgar would not have been considered old enough to effectively lead his military or his country. At the same time, Harold Godwin's son emerged as the strongest possibility to the crown of England. He was well liked by the people despite having a distant and tenuous claim to the English royal line and Danish royal relatives. He was extremely wealthy and, most importantly, was an adult who had already proven himself in battle many times. The Witan voted him in as king without even blinking at Edgar, and England was a country worth fighting for. Over the last few centuries, it had emerged as one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe at that time, and had a flourishing economy, partially thanks to its rich resources and its easy placement for trading with Scandinavia, France, and what would become known as the Low Countries, including Flanders. The Normans immediately saw Harold accepting the English crown as the worst possible betrayal. Or at least, they definitely played up that angle of it. William immediately began making preparations to invade and press his claim. And it appears Matilda completely agreed with her husband and supported him. William wrote to the Pope to ask for his support in justifying his claim, and as Harold didn't consider doing the same thing, the Pope threw his lot in with the Duke. On the 18th of June 1066, Matilda arranged an important ceremony at her abbey in Caen, inviting senior churchmen and nobles from across the duchy. But more than this, the ducal couple offered up their daughter Cecilia to be entered into the nunnery. Other noblemen present did the same, presenting their daughters, sisters, and occasionally their mothers to enter the abbey. It was, in their eyes, a deal with God, our daughters in exchange for England. While it's likely Matilda felt great pain at handing over one of her much-loved daughters, it was seen as a worthy path for a woman to follow, and as a young girl of the nobility, Cecilia would have found something of a life of freedom within the cloisters. She would have been allowed visitors to her private apartments, likely including her mother and siblings, and her own chaplain, as well as a higher standard of life generally. Cecilia would also have had her aunt with her, the Abbess Matilda who ran the abbey, who provided the girl's education from that point on. Cecilia would also later become the abbess herself in adulthood. But Matilda still had work to do in helping her husband's invasion, and she did this by providing him with a magnificent ship for his voyage across the English Channel. It was named Mora, built in the style of a Scandinavian longship, and was larger and faster than any of the other ships in William's fleet. Interestingly, Matilda also commissioned an unusual figurehead that was different to the usual dragons or sea monsters, a golden child, pointing with one hand and holding a horn to their lips with the other. Historians have wondered over whether this represented one of their existing sons, or perhaps a son that Matilda thought might be born in England to continue their dynasty. It is possible she was pregnant at this time, although it would turn out to be a daughter. The masthead also featured a sacred banner that had been sent from Rome with the Pope's blessing to indicate his agreement of William's endeavour. To top it all off, Matilda kept it secret until William was putting his fleet together in late August, and he was so astounded with the Mora that it was immediately made his flagship. By July, William had gathered his forces, although estimates of how many there were ranged between 5,000 and the wildly unlikely 50,000 by William of Poitiers. There were probably around 700 to 1,000 ships and around 5,000 to 7,000 men from Normandy, France, Brittany, Maine and Flanders. But before he set off, the Duke had the small matter of who to leave in charge of his lands. Although his eldest son Robert was now 14 and with some military experience under his belt could easily have been expected to rule the duchy in his father's absence, it was Matilda who was named as regent. This widened the gap between father and son, but it only served to bring Matilda and Robert closer together as he remained by her side throughout her regency. She would now be able to levy taxes, use a military force left at her disposal, oversee justice, and make laws. Other contemporary women would have been able to become regents, but this was usually in the wake of their husband's death. That Matilda had been given this position over all other possible male candidates was unprecedented, and it would have been fairly shocking. But to try and soften the blow, William also left 3 of his closest men to advise Matilda, including his right-hand man, Roger de Montgomery. Finally, on the 27th of September, a favourable wind picked up and William set off for England. The situation in England was already warlike. Harold had raced up to the north to face off his brother Tostig, who had joined forces with Harald Hardrada of Norway. The 2 armies met at Stamford Bridge near York, and Harold emerged victorious. He had little time to enjoy the victory though, as news reached him that William's forces had arrived at Pevensey in East Sussex, and he turned his men around in a 5-day forced march back to London. They rested there for 6 days before moving south to meet the Duke's challenge. William had a much more relaxed time of it, his new ship apparently so fast that he paused in the middle of the channel to have breakfast with wine while the rest of his fleet caught up. By October the 2nd, the Duke's men were stationed at Hastings, where William set up camp. He declared that wherever his victory would be won, he would build a church there in celebration, and for the sins of him, his family, and of everyone who had accompanied him. On the 14th of October, the 2 armies finally met. Harold's surprised by William's, as the Duke had sent ahead spies to know where his enemy was. Harold's troops were made up of Saxon nobles and their household troops, many armed with Danish two-handed axes. The Norman troops, by contrast, were made up of archers and crossbowmen, with armoured infantry behind and knights in chainmail bringing up the rear. This was in William's favour, as he was able to employ a range of tactics, while the English could only really defend, albeit from a high position on a hill. The fighting was ferocious and went on nearly a full day, the two armies fairly evenly matched despite their advantages. Famously, there was supposedly a panic amongst William's ranks that he was dead, whereupon he lifted his helmet to prove he was still alive, shouting, "I am alive, and with God's help I will conquer," an incident that was immortalised on the Bayeux Tapestry. Eventually, the deciding factor was Harold falling in the fight. The story was that he received an arrow in the eye and died from this injury, but more likely is that he was set upon by a group of knights after being injured from the arrow. The English troops either fled or faced off in what would be a Norman slaughter of their ranks. William was now the Conqueror, and Matilda was the Conqueror's wife. This was actually the beginning of what would be a years-long campaign to bring England under Norman control. The battle, bloody and furious, was a start, with many English nobles now dead. William's cruel streak came through already, with both English and Norman accounts stating that he ordered his own men to be buried, but for the Anglo-Saxons to be left out to rot, especially that of Harold's. His justification was that they had supported a tyrant, but of course it was simply a cruel act because he could. A messenger was sent to Normandy to give Matilda the news. She was delighted, as she was now Queen of England, something she could not have imagined being when she was a small girl back in Flanders. Matilda immediately set out to send large amounts of money to various religious institutions in Normandy in the name of her husband's victory, making sure they were very publicly known. She may even have commissioned an epic poem in 1068 by Guy, Bishop of Amiens, lauding William's achievements in a propaganda puff piece that basically said the Duke had only taken what was his by right and Harold had stolen his crown. The one thing Matilda was not responsible for, which for many years was credited to her, was the Bayeux Tapestry. Most historians now agree it was probably William's half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and was crafted by a combination of English artists in Kent and possibly French artists in Normandy. But Matilda had no reason yet to give up her regency, as all the Duke had really done was kill the English king and fight a battle in which most of the local nobility were bumped off. He still had to work his way across England and subjugate it beneath Norman rule, and that would be far from an easy job. After learning about Harold's death, the remaining Anglo-Saxon nobles who had gathered in London decided to pull poor Edgar Etheling back out again, declaring him once more as King of England. It was obvious they didn't really have any conviction in the idea of Edgar ruling, as they had only recently ruled against him coming to the crown, and it was entirely about trying to repel William. No doubt had they succeeded, he would have been little more than a puppet for their ambitions. William ensured that his invasion was the bloodiest England had ever faced. On his march to London, he and his forces used brute force against the Anglo-Saxon people to force them to bend to his rule, and entire towns, villages and hamlets were systematically burned to the ground, and their inhabitants killed or worse. Queen Edith, the widow of Edward the Confessor and sister to Harold, was taken from her stronghold at Winchester to prevent the English rallying behind her. Both cities collapsed to William's brutality, and as the Duke narrowed in on London, some of the nobles began to negotiate with him. Edgar's coronation was put to one side, never to happen, and he was taken to Berkhamsted to officially bend the knee to William and relinquish the throne of England. Arrangements were made for William's coronation in December, although he had initially wanted to wait until he and Matilda could be crowned together, to allow her regal ancestry and links to Alfred the Great add legitimacy to himself. Instead, it was decided it would be prudent, in the face of English resistance, to get it done as soon as possible. His crown was new, but William planned the ceremony to not only be done in the traditional Anglo-Saxon style, but also in Westminster Abbey, where Harold had been crowned. Far from being a gleeful celebration, the English who turned up to witness the coronation were silent and resentful against the new king they saw as a usurper, only the Normans cheering as the Duke went past on Christmas Day, 1066. Matilda now began treating herself as a queen, but William wanted to ensure she would be properly crowned. It was an unpopular idea, and only Edith of Wessex and Aelfrith of Devon before Matilda had actually been given the pomp and importance of a coronation for themselves. There's no doubt the new queen would also have been eager to get hold of her new wealth, having been granted rich lands in the south of England, possibly around a quarter of what William had claimed for himself. On top of this, she received Queen's Gold, a tenth of all fines paid to the crown. However, 2 years would go by until Matilda actually reached England for her crowning, most likely because she was pregnant when William set sail with their daughter Adela. Travelling the English Channel could be difficult enough in the 11th century, but it was definitely not advisable for pregnant women. A similar delay would cause problems for Matilda's granddaughter Empress Matilda when she needed to claim her crown years later. Not that the Anglo-Saxons would have been happy to see her, as they were busy hating their current Norman ruler. William's rule was inflexible and brutal, and those who didn't agree were tortured, mutilated, or killed. Motte and Bailey castles were rapidly built to remind the population who was now in charge, kept in check by laws passed stating only William himself could give permission for building them. Anglo-Saxon nobles were replaced with Norman ones, although the one thing the English possibly agreed with was the building of several new churches and cathedrals. Although William retained much of the English system of government and administration, which was superior to that of Normandy's, keeping a council of advisors, the new earls no longer had the autonomy their English predecessors had. Now they were all expected to raise taxes and armies, but under the control of the new king. Meanwhile, Matilda had maintained her son's regency successfully in Normandy, ensuring no threats within or outside were a problem, and keeping it running smoothly and ensuring the economy was great. But her ambition wouldn't let her remain there for long, and by 1068 England's new queen was ready to cross the English Channel for the first time to join her husband. And far from stemming William's tirade of violence, Matilda would instead support him as he stamped his authority literally on England. But she would also be part of enormous changes to both England and Normandy, as well as influencing the choices her sons would make. Come back next week for part 3, the final part of Matilda's story. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, Matilda of Flanders, once merely Duchess of Normandy, was now also Queen of England. Far from being a passive, genteel wife to William the Conqueror, Matilda would in fact be a force to be reckoned with in her own right, continuing as regent in Normandy at times, supporting William's most brutal decisions as king, at times being brave enough to go against his decisions, and even influencing matters long after her death. By 1068, Matilda was finally ready to join her husband in England. She had remained in Normandy for 2 years as regent, partly because she was pregnant with their daughter Adela. In William's absence, Matilda had held on to the duchy with an iron fist, ensuring it lost no territory, the economy blossomed, and dealing with the inevitable political infighting. Orderic Vitalis described how the various nobles left in Normandy fell to arguing with each other, using the situation to try and oust others from their positions at court, but Matilda smoothed over every conflict. Medieval noblewomen at this time were known as the peacemakers of their kingdoms, and so it was a role Matilda would easily have taken on. But this was no small achievement. Being in firm control of Normandy allowed William to completely focus his attention on bringing England under his boot. Matilda's grip of Normandy won her the admiration and respect of its nobility. She would have had to travel constantly across the various strongholds of the duchy, often taking her children with her. However, some writers, such as William of Poitiers, snarkily pointed out that the peace that fell over Normandy was less to do with Matilda and more to do with the fear of William's return. In the spring of 1067, the new King of England returned to Normandy, delighted with the way his wife had run the show in his absence. However, English sources then report another story, one that does not appear in any Norman sources and is based in next to no fact. Supposedly, a knight named Grimaud du Plessis told William that Matilda had been unfaithful to him while he was away. Confronting Matilda with this rumour, William dragged her out of bed and tied her hair to a horse's tail, forcing her to walk naked through the streets of Caen as punishment until she reached the Abbaye de Homme. He then locked her up in a dungeon and only let her out when she repeated her innocence. To the knight who had lied to him, William told his men to hunt Grimaud down and skin him alive before quartering him. Aside from anything else, this was impossible, as Grimaud was long dead before 1067. He was a rebel who had once fought against William, dying in Rouen shortly after 1047, 20 years before. It's also highly unlikely that Matilda would have risked her husband's temper, especially as she rarely had privacy anyway while ruling as regent. It's possible this story was based on some truth. Perhaps there were rumours of Matilda's infidelity but no proof. Perhaps those who were her or William's enemies spread these rumours. We will never know. But there is another story, this time involving Matilda in a more dominant place that is also reported in English sources. Breitrich, who had spurned her offer of marriage 2 decades earlier, had his manor of Tewkesbury given to Matilda, and he himself was thrown into prison. Apparently, he spent 2 years there until he mysteriously died, and it was largely thought it was Matilda who had arranged his murder. However, yet again, this is only shown in English sources, and there may even be evidence that goes contrary to this tale. There is a charter granted by William to the Bishop of Wells that was likely given at Matilda's coronation in 1068. Amongst the last signatures is that of Breitrich himself, suggesting he was not only alive at the time but also present at her crowning. And to be honest, it's probably far more likely that Matilda couldn't care less about an aging Anglo-Saxon noble while she was married to a man she clearly found attractive who had just taken an entire kingdom by force, ensuring she was now a queen. But again, there's perhaps a kernel of truth to the idea of revenge. Certainly Matilda did end up with a lot of Breitrich's lands, giving some away and keeping many for herself. It's far more likely the pragmatic new queen took away what she knew would hurt him the most, his family's lands and wealth, if she had any desire to do so. Equally, as one of the largest landholders in England, it's also possible Matilda ended up with so many of his properties simply because Breitrich held so many in the first place. Breitrich would also have been in his 60s by this time, an age at which many people at the time died simply of natural causes. Either way, by early 1068, William sent messengers that Matilda was now to join him in his new kingdom. There is no record of her voyage, but it was the first time Matilda had ever travelled beyond French borders, and she was accompanied by a large and impressive retinue that signified her new status. She arrived just after Easter, sometime in late March, and her reception by the English people was lukewarm at best. They weren't pleased at having a Norman ruler at all, and they were even less impressed with a woman known as a ruler in her own right back in Normandy. But for William, he didn't care about the English people's feelings towards Matilda, only that he could now use her regal ancestry to press his own legitimacy, particularly as Matilda was probably heavily pregnant from his last visit to Normandy. This would be her last child, but in her mid-30s she had given birth to an impressive number of children who had survived to adulthood. Her coronation was planned for Whit Sunday on the 11th of May at Westminster Abbey, a hugely important religious festival. This date emphasised the message that both Matilda and William had been chosen by God to lead, cemented by the fact that she would be the first Queen Consort of England to be styled Regina. The ceremony was a mixture of traditional Anglo-Saxon and modern Norman. The same ritual as her English predecessors would have been carried out, with Matilda praying at the altar, being anointed with holy oil, and given a ring to symbolise marriage to the kingdom and support for her husband the king. But Matilda also had special laudes written for her coronation, ritual chants, and this was a Norman practice designed to impress those watching. These laudes also stated that Matilda was to share in the power of her husband in ruling the English people, and the female saints normally invoked in a queen's chants were replaced by male apostles, further showing her place as an equal by William's side. This was a turning point for hundreds of years of English queen consorts to come and eventually queen regnants. From this point on, queens would not merely be expected to provide airs and shirts, although that remained part of their identity and duties, but also to be involved politically, as a supportive role to their king, to be involved religiously in the systems of their country, as well as financial matters. A grand banquet followed the coronation, and both the ceremony and the banquet were attended not only by Norman but also by Anglo-Saxon nobility, in contrast to William's ceremony 2 years earlier. This was partly due to Matilda's English ancestry to Alfred the Great and was partly a sign of William's control over the English nobles. This attempt at merging the cultures together was mirrored elsewhere, as William arranged marriages between Saxon heiresses and his Norman knights and nobles, which incidentally also gave him more control over their lands. With Matilda remaining in England to await the birth of their last child, William now set about fortifying several towns across his new lands to help prevent rebellion, starting with York. The royal couple also took over the deceased King Edward's palace at Westminster and would add to it with a magnificent extension by 1069. Matilda went to join her husband in Yorkshire, partly because she probably wanted to see him, and partly because giving birth in York would help inspire the loyalty of the people there. As it turned out, making the arduous journey north while heavily pregnant seems to have set Matilda's labour off earlier than planned, and she gave birth to their fourth son Henry in Selby, a town south of the city. But unfortunately, this wouldn't inspire the loyalty the royal couple hoped for. Feeling as though they had obviously impressed themselves enough on the local population, William and Matilda returned to Normandy for Christmas, but it was a misjudged move. In the new king's absence, Anglo-Saxon forces had risen behind Edgar Etheling, who was now steadily heading south through Northumbria and targeting William's new castles throughout 1069. The north of England was somewhat removed from the south despite being the same country, with the people there descended from a mixture of Saxon, Dane and Norwegian people, and they may even have spoken a different dialect of English to those in the south. But most importantly, they had often been given something close to autonomy over the region for many decades. It was probably easy for Edgar to encourage them to rise against a ruler who demanded absolute control over them. Matilda was left in Normandy as William sailed once again to England. By April 1069, he had retaken York and he paid the Danes to stand down and leave, but the remaining rebels refused to surrender. William enacted a terrible revenge for this slight. In order to force them out to fight him, the king decided to use scorched earth tactics, burning crops, villages and homes, looting and slaughtering many of the inhabitants. He removed the northern nobles, replacing them with Normans he could trust. Some historians, quite understandably, are uncertain as to whether William could actually have mustered the force needed to carry out this attack, which became known as the Harrying of the North. But the Domesday Book years later showed that as much as 75% of the population of Yorkshire and Northumbria may have perished through famine or outright murder. While it's likely the attack was highly exaggerated in the centuries afterwards, this was only because of the horror it gave birth to at the time. Even William himself would regret his actions in years to come, and it alienated many who had come to be sympathetic to the Norman cause. All chroniclers reported the events with obvious shock, appalled at the devastation wrought upon the north, especially on so many people innocent of the crime of being rebels, instead simply living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Simeon of Durham, writing around 40 years later, recorded how people had fallen down with hunger in the roads while leaving their homes. Others had sold themselves into slavery to try and survive, and others still had resorted even to cannibalism to stave off their hunger. But William wasn't alone in England. Matilda had returned also by the spring of 1069, and while she wouldn't be as brutal as her husband, her actions would support him in his tactics in the north. This was completely about public relations, and she set up in London as William harassed the north of the country. She was joined by their son Richard and later by William himself in a show of family solidarity. Matilda would have been the main orchestrator of events at Easter, Christmas and Whitsun, yet more opportunities for the royal family to show off their wealth and power. She would have been responsible for the dishes served, the rolls given out to servants, and for annual gifts given out to the various nobles present. But it wasn't just the food and entertainment that was lavish. Matilda herself made sure she matched them with her appearance. Contemporary accounts stated that she dressed in purple and gold, and she paid English seamstresses, considered at that time the best in Europe, to make dresses for her. But by the summer of 1069, despite smoothing things over in the south, William sent Matilda back to Normandy to ensure his realm there was kept safe. When the Queen returned to the duchy, she found it in a worse position than it had been left. Maine had broken out in rebellion, and Normandy's hold over it vanished. To make matters worse, King Philip I of France and Hoel II, Duke of Brittany, decided to take advantage of the situation and attack Normandy. Whatever military Matilda had at her disposal wasn't enough, as she had to urgently send a message to William to send men, which he did with all haste to defend both his wife and duchy. But another conflict was about to happen, which was very much a family affair for Matilda. In July 1070, her brother Count Baldwin VI, who had been in charge of Flanders since their father's death, died suddenly himself. His son and heir, Arnulf, was only 15, and just like in England when Edgar had only been a teenager, others took advantage of his youth. But the person who tried to take Flanders for himself was none other than the boy's uncle, Robert the Frisian, Matilda's other brother. Matilda immediately sent word to William to send troops, and while he was initially reluctant to get involved in a family squabble that posed little threat to his lands, the king did send William Fitz-Osbern, one of his most trusted men, with a small force of soldiers. Equally, Matilda's mother, Adela, leant on her connections to French royalty and asked King Philip to also lend aid to the young Arnulf. It was Robert who was triumphant in the end, and both Fitz-Osbern and Arnulf died in battle. William had no choice but to accept his brother-in-law Robert as the new Count of Flanders. Adela managed to find a place for herself at Flanders court, and Philip decided to wash his hands of the whole affair. For Matilda, she was beyond upset with Robert, seeing his actions as not only a stain on their family, but also for the fact he had killed their nephew. It also destroyed the alliance between their two lands. When Arnulf's mother Rochildis fled with her remaining son Baldwin to Hainault and began to plan on taking Flanders back, both William and Matilda supported them. As for Robert, no love was lost between him and William, despite being brothers-in-law, and he would later become a pain in William's backside by assisting in invading England with King Canute IV of Denmark, his son-in-law, and by allowing Anglo-Saxon refugees to settle in Flanders. Nevertheless, the whole event showed that Matilda was both ambitious and had a sense of justice. Although it's possible, she also felt she had a right to govern Flanders herself. Over the following years, she would continue to go back and forth across the English Channel, a total of 8 times from her first journey, and she was regent in Normandy several times. But she saw a lot more of William as well, as from around 1072, after settling a truce with King of the Scots Malcolm III, he spent most of his time in Normandy rather than England. However, the royal couple had to ensure they were always in the memory of the English people, and they did this with regular crown-wearing ceremonies. Matilda was present for all of William's crown wearings, which generally involved the couple being prominently seen in public at festivals such as Easter and Christmas, wearing, as the name suggests, their crowns. These events would have had great pomp and opulence, and all important nobility, gentry and clergy were invited. The whole thing about showing off William and Matilda's legitimacy as King and Queen Consort of England. It was something that would be continued for centuries afterwards, with monarchs of England and later of Great Britain only wearing their crowns for important events. Just as she had in Normandy, Matilda also encouraged the arts into court and became a patron to many English poets and authors such as Godfrey of Winchester. Not only that, but Matilda continued to expand on her role as adjudicator of justice by overseeing cases. One such example was of a Norman official, Alfsey, who complained that the abbot of Abingdon Abbey had beaten him and driven off his oxen. It turned out the official had been taking the oxen from the local populace and taking from their woodland, and the abbot had simply had enough. Alfsey must have hoped the Queen would find in his favour as a fellow countrywoman, but the abbot cleverly offered a large sum of money in exchange for his violent behaviour. As a result, Matilda ordered that there should be no more exploiting land or goods by royal officials. This had a great bearing on the entire country now, not only a small local area, and it also shows once again that Matilda's sense of justice was stronger than any favouritism she may have had towards Norman subjects. Over the years, Matilda also increasingly leaned into religion more than she ever had. She gave several expensive gifts of jewels, money and chalices to abbeys and monasteries in both Normandy and England. And although Matilda seems to have spoken to few people outside of Normandy or England, she did strike up a correspondence with Pope Gregory VII from 1074. He mostly seems to have asked her to use her influence with William to encourage him to be more pious, something which shows not only was Matilda seen as a deeply religious woman, but as a woman who had a calming influence over her husband. However, sometime around this period, possibly earlier but certainly by 1075, tragedy struck. Matilda and William's second son Richard had accompanied his father to England. He especially loved hunting and spent much of his time in the New Forest, an area created by William himself. But Richard was involved in a severe riding accident in which he either died instantly or of his injuries. He was certainly young, probably around 19 or 20. The entire family was hit hard by his death, and Matilda grieved deeply at the death of one of her children, her pious donations increasing at the same time in a possible reaction. Not long after, they also lost their eldest daughter Adeliza, who may have entered a nunnery in her late teens. Again, Matilda was racked with grief, especially as there appears to have been something of a rift between Adeliza and her parents due to several proposals that never happened. But one of their children would cause a split between William and Matilda, their eldest son, Robert. He had been left mainly in Normandy with his mother acting as regent, but when she travelled to England, he was left in charge. However, by the late 1070s, Robert was impatient for some authority of his own, and William was reluctant to give it. This was partly because of the animosity between them, and partly because while Robert was considered generous and brave, he was also easily led, impulsive, and was more fond of entertainments than ruling effectively. However, in 1077, events came to a dramatic head. Robert's brothers, William Rufus and Henry, poured the contents of a chamber pot over him. Furious, he raised an argument with them, and when their father got involved, was angered further that they received no punishment. The next day, Robert rode off with his companions to take the castle at Rouen, and when this failed, they fled to Robert's uncle of the same name in Flanders. Count Robert was of course glad to receive his nephew and cause problems for King William. Robert Curthose caused such a problem attacking various lands on the way to Flanders that William actually allied himself with King Philip. But the bond between mother and son was so great that Matilda secretly not only kept in contact with Robert during his exile, but she also sent him money. While this obviously shows her maternal love was stronger than the sense of duty and possible love Matilda felt for William, there were also clear benefits to Robert being in charge of Normandy for her. As he now spent so much more time in Normandy, it's likely William did not allow Matilda the autonomy she once enjoyed as regent. And yet if Robert was in charge, it was likely she would be able to get a greater hold of power. However, it wasn't long before her husband found out what she had done, and the Norman king was furious with his queen. He ordered Matilda to never do such a thing again, But surprisingly, the issue went no further despite the fact she had gone behind his back and essentially committed treason. However, when she was found to have once again sent money to Robert, William humiliated her in front of the entire court. Matilda didn't beg for her life, instead kneeling at his feet and pleading the strength of her maternal feelings. She claimed that she could not possibly have held on to her own wealth as her eldest son starved, that she would give up her own life to see him live, and that her husband had no right to demand she give up feeling this way. In fury, William ordered that one of her servants be caught and blinded, possibly a servant who had transported the money to Robert, but luckily Matilda managed to help the poor man flee to an abbey before his punishment. For all of this, the Queen did finally manage to enact a truce between William and Robert at Easter in 1080, and the truce would last between them until her death. In late 1080, William would return to England and take his wife and eldest son with him, probably indicative of his dwindled trust in both. Towards Christmas of that year, Queen Margaret of Scotland asked Matilda to be godmother to her newly born daughter Edith. She travelled with Robert to Scotland for the ceremony, and there is a story that during it, little Edith pulled her godmother's headdress down upon herself. This was seen as a sign that one day the small baby would herself become a Queen of England. The sources that tell this story may have done so with hindsight, as Edith would indeed become Queen of England by later marrying Matilda and William's son Henry, changing her name to Matilda or Maud of Scotland. But by this point, Matilda had lived a long life, had gone through several pregnancies much later than most women of her time, and had continued travelling throughout her life. By 1082, she was in ill health, and the fact she wrote her will in this year suggests Matilda also thought she might not be long for this world. By the winter of 1083, Matilda's health declined further, and in the early hours of the 2nd of November, she died. William remained by his wife's side the entire time, and it was one of the few times he was ever publicly recorded as weeping. His grief was deep and instant, and he described Matilda as "my own soul," professing his love for her and falling into a deep depression from which he never really recovered. William also swore he would give up his favourite sport, hunting, to express his grief. Normandy and England were plunged into mourning for her, and Mass was spoken in her name in churches, abbeys and cathedrals across both. Chroniclers of the time had nothing but good things to say about her, and Matilda's recent dealings with Robert were forgotten in the face of a lifetime of piety, patronage, good deeds and fair dealings with those she ruled. Her body was conveyed to the Abbaye aux Dames, and William gave her a grand funeral that lasted 2 days. The sources don't state exactly which of their children attended the funeral, but as a nun at the abbey, it's likely Cecilia was there, and also Robert, considering the bond between his mother and himself. Matilda's body would suffer various indignities in death. During the 15th century religious wars in France, her effigy on top of her tomb was destroyed and her tomb plundered, although her remains would be reburied in the early 18th century with a new monument. This was destroyed during the French Revolution. It wasn't until the 19th century Matilda's coffin would be moved to its final resting place, amazingly still with the original 11th century tombstone, carved from black and white Tournai marble in honour of her Flemish origins. Her epitaph remains, carved in gold as William instructed, a reminder of her regal ancestry. After her death, bereft of her soothing presence, William became more of a tyrant than ever before for the next 4 years until his own death in 1087. His greed also apparently grew unchecked, but it was also this greed that made him carry out the largest survey of England at that point, the Domesday Book. The hostilities between her sons, and especially between Robert and his father, also hint at how much of a unifying source Matilda had been for them, and with her death it crumbled any hopes at them getting along. In years to come, this would end in open fights with one another, and Robert was banished forever to Normandy with no hope of claiming England. Eventually, after their father's death, the bitter resentments between the brothers would lead to the youngest, Henry, claiming both England and Normandy for himself. Matilda's life was an astounding one. She had begun life with regal ancestry, but only as the daughter of a count in a principality that was not important or strong enough in its own right at the time of her birth. Watching her mother as well as her father taught Matilda how to use her intelligence and sheer force of will to change this. And her ambition and strength of character meant she would succeed not only as a duchess, but as a queen. As William's wife, she is often pushed to one side in history, a shadow, standing beside her husband's more well-known and bloody accomplishments. But she was a formidable woman in her own right, calculating, intelligent, pious, and a calming and sensible influence on her hot-headed husband and sons, as well as a cultivated woman who understood the importance of politics and making relationships within their new lands. Importantly, she had become the first Queen of England to be recognised as a formally crowned ruler second only to the king, to wield political and religious power in her own right, something that would be continued in later centuries. We should remember Matilda alongside William as his equal in many areas of their lives, and recognise that the Conqueror's reign was successful, at least in part, because of Matilda. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.